After the French Revolution, the idea of nationalism starts to spread throughout Europe, and we're going to see some major changes in the political and social setup of Europe as a result. One of the first major nationalist revolts in Europe was in 1830 in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire at this point was sort of this old medieval declining empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was centered in Turkey, but it controlled pretty much all of a pretty good chunk of the eastern and southern Mediterranean basin, as well as parts of the Arabian Peninsula. But then in 1821, there was a attempt at revolution by the Greeks. Greece had long kind of not wanted to be part of this Muslim empire since they were, European and they were Christian. And there was this movement of Greek nationalism that led to the Greeks to revolt. At first, Europeans didn't see this as much of a concern, and in fact, they kind of wanted to prevent the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Even though it was old and foreign, it was a stabilizing force in that part of the world. But soon, people all over Europe really recognized that, Greece, we always associate with, ancient Greece and democracy and Socrates and all those sort of Western institutions. So soon, people across Europe, and especially Britain, supported the Greeks. And by 1830, Greece is independent as a kingdom, with a lot of support from Britain and other parts of Northern Europe. And so you start to see this idea of nationalism spread in Greece. The next big revolt comes once again in France. After Louis XVIII died, you had King Charles X. Charles, after the revolution, Louis XVIII was pretty constitutional. This is, he didn't try to do any kind of absolutism. He was limited by French law. Charles X tried to make France more absolutist, try to consolidate his power. And, on more or less the heels of the French Revolution, there's a lot of resistance to this. So in 1830, in July, there's this big revolution we call the July Revolution. And there was fighting in the streets of Paris. Once again, like the first revolution, this is led mostly by the bourgeoisie, the middle class, who are well educated. And they saw this as a chance to, reassert the ideas of the Enlightenment in France. They put on the throne Charles X's brother, Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe had promised to be sort of a middle-class king. He was going to abide by the ideas of constitutionalism and liberalism. But within 15 years or so, he really started to try and become more absolutist, reinstitute a state church, and try and limit control or limit the influence of the National Assembly. So France has another revolution in 1848 to get rid of Louis Philippe. And this revolution has a lot of ramifications because people had now, France was really influential. It was a very large state and had been through so many revolutions. So people see France as sort of a model for what they should be able to do. And so in 1848, this is really known as a year of revolutions in Europe because you're going to see revolutions break out throughout the continent. As a result of the 1848 revolution in France, France declares the Second French Republic, and it elects as its first president Louis Napoleon. That sounds familiar. This is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, and he comes to power really on the name. Even though Napoleon was, a monarch and a dictator, people remembered the glory of France as it rolled over most of Europe during that Napoleonic time, which, keep in mind, was only a little more than 30 years prior. It doesn't take long for President Louis Napoleon to declare himself Emperor Napoleon III in a coup, and now France is an empire again. But again, that year of 1848 is this year of revolutions. You can see on this map all the little red dots are places where there were attempted revolutions. And I say attempted because, with the exception of France, most of these fail. These are nationalistic revolutions. People in the German Confederation went to the King of Prussia and said, "Why don't you become Emperor of Germany?" People in the Austrian Empire over here, mostly Hungarian, said, "We want Hungary to be separate." People in northern Italy and Naples said we should unify Italy. And all these revolutions really ultimately failed. There were a few reasons for that. One is that there was a lot of division, kind of two types of division. One is that is the division in nationalism. One thing to kind of emphasize, and we talked about the difference between a nation and a state and a country. Well, national identity is really kind of squishy. One thing to keep in mind is that during the French Revolution, only about 10% of people in France actually spoke what we think of as French. So if language is one of those defining characteristics of a nation, well, there's a whole lot of languages. So it's hard to unify people who might see their neighbors as other, as somebody who belongs to a different nation. We're Czechs, they're Slovaks, so we both want to break away from Austria, but we want to do so separately. There's also division between classes. We talk about the liberals being sort of the idea behind the revolution. But often in 1848, it was the radicals who did a lot of the fighting. People who wanted a republic, people who wanted everyone to vote, not just landowners. And liberals, while they wanted better parliaments, they didn't necessarily want the radical side of the revolutions. So there's division there. And then also because of the Congress of Vienna, you had really strong actions from the top to break up attempts of revolution. States, ruling classes did not want to give up their power. They didn't want another French Revolution on their hands like we'd seen in 1789. So very quickly, these powerful empires cracked down on their revolutionaries. So because of these things, you don't see a lot of permanent changes in 1848. Now, the seeds of change are there, and gradually over the next 50 years, by the end of the century, a lot of the things the revolutionaries were looking for, constitutional monarchies, freedom of religion, more bills of rights, those things will come to pass. Although the breakup of those really big empires and some of the more nationalistic kind of fervor doesn't really